My name is Morgan Pierce. I am 32 years old. My mom pointed her champagne flute at my chest and said loud enough for the whole private dining room to hear, "You know you're lucky we even include you, right? Pity runs deeper than blood in this family." The clink of crystal and the low hum of conversations around us did nothing to soften it. Servers paused just a second too long. My dad stared down at his phone, and my older sister Sydney smirked into her lobster tail like this was the punchline of a joke she had already heard. If you were sitting at that table, what would you do? Would you swallow it to keep the peace, or finally say something back? As you listen, tell me what you would have done and where you're watching from, because that sentence was the one that finally snapped whatever was left of my loyalty to them. We were on the rooftop of a brickell high-rise, the kind of place with glass railings, white tablecloths, and a panoramic view of Biscayne Bay that people post on Instagram, just to prove they were there. And yet, the only thing I really saw was the small curl of satisfaction at the corner of my mom's mouth when she realized other tables had heard her. A couple near the railing pretended to read their menus while blatantly listening. My dad finally set his phone down and leaned in, like he had suddenly remembered I existed. "Speaking of family, he said your mother and I were talking with Gemma about redoing the top floors at the Dolores." The Dolores was our Art Deco hotel on South Beach, named after my grandmother, tucked into a hospitality trust like a trophy the Pierce family brought out whenever they wanted to brag about old Miami roots. "We're gutting that old lounge and turning it into a rooftop pool," he announced. "Cabana's a proper bar, the works. It will finally feel like a real resort instead of a museum." Sydney whistled, already half reaching for her phone. "About time we did something fun with that dinosaur," she said, probably imagining content, not consequences. The dinosaur she meant was the Skyline Lounge, my grandmother's top-floor bar, where she had hosted musicians in the 1970s, kept handwritten notebooks behind the counter, and lined the walls with vinyl and photographs. Growing up, the lounge was the only place in our world where I felt like more than the awkward little sister. She would sit me on a bar stool, put on a record, and ask what I wanted my life to look like when it was mine. In her will, she had written my name clearly, leaving me the lounge and its contents with a line saying any structural changes had to be approved by both co-trustees of the Hospitality Trust. "You're tearing out the lounge?" I asked, fingers locked around my water glass, because if I was holding champagne, I might throw it. My mom waved a manicured hand as if she were shooing a fly. "Oh, please, it's a dusty relic." And the attorney said the hotel is co-owned. "We're improving the property value, not hurting it." I said Grandma left that lounge to me. That is in writing. My mom smiled wider, the way she does when she wants to hurt me, and call it honesty. "Morgan, you should be grateful we even invite you. You've always been such a sad little loner. Pity is what seats you at this table." It was not the first time she addressed cruelty up as concern. 2 years earlier, I had stood on stage at a downtown tech conference squinting into bright lights, while a ballroom full of executives clapped as I accepted an Under 35 Innovators Award for the real-time analytics engine I had built. The project had saved a national brand millions of dollars. Strangers with badges and titles I respected kept telling me how impressive it was. Afterward, during the reception, one of my old professors from Georgia Tech walked over to the cocktail table where my parents were perched with their complimentary drinks. "You must be so proud," she said to my mom. "Morgan's work on streaming data pipelines is years ahead of where most teams are." My mom pressed a hand to her chest so her necklace caught the light and cooed. "We're just thankful she found a little niche she's good at. Poor thing always struggled with people, so this computer stuff is perfect for her." I watched my professor's smile freeze and slide into something like pity. I excused myself to the restroom, locked myself in a stall, and sat there listening to the air conditioner until my heart stopped pounding. That phrase, "poor thing," stayed with me longer than the award did. On paper, I was the success story director of data engineering at a growing Miami tech firm, the person companies called when their systems were too messy and their data too chaotic to understand. At home, I was our Morgan, the younger sister, who fixed the Wi-Fi at my parents' waterfront house, restored my dad's files when he clicked on phishing links, and built a custom dashboard so he could see every hotel, restaurant, and rental property on one screen without opening 20 tabs. 8 years earlier, when he complained about being buried in spreadsheets, I had offered to help, naively thinking that if I built something elegant and powerful, he would finally see me as more than the quiet kid who preferred code to cocktails. I spent nights and weekends connecting loan covenants, occupancy rates, vendor invoices, tax returns, and trust distributions into one secure portal with alerts and backups that would have cost them a fortune if they had hired a consulting firm. I designed disaster recovery flows, audit trails, and user controls, wrote documentation no one in my family ever read, and handed it to them as a gift. They called it Morgan's Little App, like I had made them a cute game instead of the system holding their entire hospitality business together. Driving home from that rooftop dinner, the skyline glittered along the causeway, neon reflected on dark water. But the only thing I really felt was a tired, heavy anger sitting under my ribs. My mom's sentence kept replaying, "You should be grateful we even invite you." Once those words existed in the air, I could not shove them back into the mental box where I kept all the other things she had said. I parked in my Brickell garage, rode the elevator with a couple dressed for a night out, and realized my hands were shaking as I unlocked my apartment door. For 8 years, I had told myself that if I kept everything running smoothly, if I made their lives easier, they would eventually respect me, maybe even listen, when I warned them how fragile their setup was. Instead, they laughed, took my work for granted, and quietly scheduled a demolition of the one space my grandmother had clearly meant for me. In the stillness of my living room, with traffic humming far below and the bay a dark sheet beyond the glass, I finally admitted a truth I had been avoiding. My belief that they could not function without me had been protecting them far more than it ever protected me, and I was the one paying the price. Sunday night in Miami has its own rhythm boats drifting back to Marina's plains, banking over the water, bass thumping faintly from some rooftop bar, while I sat at my dining table, opened my laptop, and logged into the Pierce hospitality portal I had built. 3 monitors lit up with occupancy heat maps, cash flow graphs, vendor payment queues, and trust distribution schedules more familiar to me than most of my friendships. I could see which hotel had a plumbing problem before the general manager finished dialing my dad. 5 years earlier, after a friend's resort was hit with ransomware, my dad had panicked and asked what it would take to lock all this down. I had drafted a master administrator agreement that made us co-administrators of the Hospitality Trust and granted what the document called unilateral emergency powers for asset protection. I walked him through the basics. He flipped to the signature page, scribbled his name, and said, "Just make it work, kiddo." He never read the clause that let me shut everything off if I suspected fraud. Staring at those screens that night, hearing my mother's voice in my head, I decided to use that clause exactly as written, not as my dad imagined it. I started with what should have been routine maintenance integrity checks, duplicate vendor scans, confirmation that nightly backups had completed. Almost immediately, a string of transfers from the hospitality reserve account caught my eye. Over the last 18 months, large payments had gone to an entity called Sunrise Consulting Group. On paper, Sunrise looked like a vendor submitting invoices with vague descriptions like strategic advisory services and brand expansion analysis, but the amounts were wrong. $25,000 one month, $42,000, the next $60,000 after that, another $28,000 a few weeks later. I drilled into the metadata and felt my stomach twist. Sunrise's beneficiary was listed as Sydney Pierce, and the routing number pointed directly to a checking account tied to her Social Security number. When I overlaid card charges on those dates, the money lined up with casino markers in Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and a Bahamas resort that bragged about its high roller suites. My calculations put the total at just over $510,000 siphoned from the hospitality trust into my sister's gambling habit, all disguised as consulting. Next, I opened the Dolores's file. Because my system mirrored county records, the permitting documents from Miami Beach were stored alongside internal reports time-stamped and neatly filed by the software I had written. A renovation plan submitted 3 weeks earlier described a full structural and design overhaul of upper-level entertainment space, with sleek renderings showing the Skyline Lounge erased and replaced by a rectangular pool, a modern bar, and rows of cabanas lined up where my grandmother's stage used to be. Digital signatures at the bottom listed my mom as the interior applicant, and a contract from designer Gemma Lee showed $190,000 in deposits already paid from the same hospitality reserve Sunrise had been draining. They had not just talked about destroying my inheritance over dinner, they had already begun paying for it with stolen trust money. A red notification flashed in the corner of my screen. Concurrent administrative session detected. I opened the security panel and saw Sydney logged in queuing another transfer from the reserve to Sunrise, this one for $50,000, labeled third quarter strategic planning set to process in the 11 o'clock nightly batch, just like every consulting fee before it. I watched that pending transfer sit in the queue like a lit fuse and realized that if I did nothing again, I would be complicit again. I glanced at the clock, 10:43. I opened the emergency protocol interface I had coded and never used and hesitated just long enough to exhale. First, I triggered a full encrypted backup to an external drive already docked on my desk. Transaction logs, email approvals, contract uploads, user access histories, and 8 years of receipts poured into a vault. While a progress bar crawled across one monitor, I used another to activate the emergency lock on the hospitality reserve and every trust sub-account, freezing outgoing transfers until an administrator cleared them under multi-factor authentication. Sydney's wire flipped from pending to declined security hold, and her session threw an error that would log her out and present a bland message about system maintenance, because that was the language I had chosen when I never thought I would use it. I moved through each bank and property login, enforcing multi-factor authentication, changing master passwords into 60-character random strings, and stripping overdraft protection so overspending would finally have immediate consequences. It did not feel like revenge. It felt like walking into a kitchen that reeked of gas and finally turning the valve off before someone lit a match. With the system contained, I opened a secure email client I never used for family and pulled up a contact labeled, "Just in case Isla Benton, a family business attorney." I had met at a Women in Tech conference when she spoke about relatives mixing emotions with money and expecting you to keep fixing everything with a smile. During a break, she had handed me her card and said, "If your family ever treats you like unpaid staff, call me." That card had lived in my desk drawer for 2 years like a quiet dare. Now I typed urgent hospitality trust violations and will breach, and laid out the facts: disguised transfers to my sister's shell company, casino payments, renovation deposits for the Dolores, and the clause in my grandmother's will requiring both co-trustees to approve structural changes. I attached spreadsheets, signed authorizations, the master admin agreement my dad had signed, screenshots of the blocked transfer, and asked if we could meet the next morning. Then I drafted a second email to my dad, copying my mom and Sydney formally resigning as system administrator, noting that security protocols had been updated under the emergency provisions he had approved, and directing all questions to Isla. I hit send, shut my laptop, and powered off my phone before anyone could start demanding explanations I no longer owed them. The fallout hit around 9 the next morning while I sat in my kitchen with a mug of coffee, watching light crawl across the bay. I was not at my dad's golf club in Coral Gables when he slid his platinum card across the counter and watched it get declined, but my system fed me the alert charge, rejected security hold. I could picture the confusion, then the anger, then the way he would look around for someone to blame who was not in the mirror. 15 minutes later, 3 casinos pinged our banks trying to call in Sydney's markers. Those lines to the hospitality accounts were blocked, now forcing them to chase her directly instead of quietly tapping a family backstop. At 9:30, a standing wire to Gemma for her design retainer on the Dolores bounced with a blunt note about frozen funds pending review. By 10:15, my phone, now back on the counter, lit up with missed calls. 6 from my dad, 8 from Sydney, 4 from my mom, and a flood of texts ranging from, "What did you do to? You have embarrassed us to unlock everything right now, or you will regret it." My cousin Damien, who had grown up worshipping my dad's success, added, "Everyone is freaking out. Can you just fix whatever this is?" The Pierce family group chat was a scroll of capital letters and blame. I silenced the thread, finished my coffee, and drove downtown to meet Isla, feeling oddly calm in the eye of a storm I had finally stopped holding back. On Wednesday morning, we sat together at one end of a long glass table on the 37th floor of her firm, facing my dad and 2 attorneys from his usual shop. The room looked out over Biscayne Bay, quiet and cold in that expensive way that suggests nothing messy happens there, even though the ugliest fights in the city probably get choreographed in offices just like it. My dad did not bother with a greeting. "Undo whatever you did," he said, dropping into a chair. "Right now." Isla's pen moved once across her legal pad before she looked up. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Pierce. Before we talk about undoing anything, we need to talk about why my client used her emergency powers in the first place." One attorney laced his fingers and said they believed I had effectively hijacked family assets. Isla slid a folder across the table. Inside were transaction logs showing every payment to Sunrise Consulting Group casino records, and copies of my weekly reports noting irregular withdrawals. My dad barely skimmed them before snapping, "Sydney is allowed to use family funds. She's developing a resort concept. Conferences and trips are part of that." Isla tapped the master administrator agreement. "The hospitality trust language is very specific," she said. "Funds are for maintenance, debt service, and capital improvements, approved by both co-administrators. There is nothing here about gambling or shell consulting firms. Morgan flagged this months ago. Your response was to tell her to handle it and keep signing off?" The younger attorney squinted at the emergency powers clause and finally admitted it gave me broad authority to freeze accounts in cases of suspected misuse. My dad's jaw clenched. "She is my daughter, not a regulator," he said. "This should have stayed in the family." Isla did not flinch. "She did keep it in the family, Arthur. She kept it in the family for 8 years while you ignored her warnings. Here is our proposal: full forensic accounting of all trust-related transactions for the last 2 years. If she crossed a line, we will own it. If Sydney did, you will. If you refuse, we will see you in court." 2 days later, Isla forwarded a one-line email they retained Trevor Nash. Underneath, she had typed, "He is expensive. Your dad is nervous." Even outside legal circles in Miami, people knew Trevor's name. He was the litigator big developers called when they wanted to bury opponents in motions and settlements that never saw daylight. Within a week, he filed a partition lawsuit on my dad's behalf, claiming I had obstructed reasonable business decisions regarding the Dolores and failed to maintain property value by blocking the rooftop renovation. The story he wanted to tell was simple and familiar. Bitter younger daughter sabotages family business over sentimental junk. My mom launched her own campaign calling relatives in Orlando, Tampa, and New York to say I had lost it and was destroying the family over an old bar nobody used, conveniently skipping the part where she had signed off on spending trust money on my sister's gambling. Cousins who barely spoke to me otherwise suddenly texted long messages urging me to be reasonable and not air family business in public. I stared at Damien's wall of texts, did not answer, and instead forwarded my mom's nastiest messages to Isla, who filed them away under harassment and smear tactics. Every time my phone lit up with another relative demanding I back down for the sake of family, it just confirmed how carefully my mother had curated her version of events. The story leaked exactly how my mom wanted and exactly how my dad did not. A local lifestyle site that loved South Beach nostalgia ran a piece titled Pierce Family Feud over Iconic Art Deco Hotel, quoting unnamed sources close to the family who said a difficult younger daughter was blocking modernization. There was a golden hour photo of the Dolores' pastel facade and a dramatic line about old Miami versus new Miami, but nothing about trust language or $500,000 quietly turned into casino chips. My phone buzzed all afternoon with messages from people I barely knew asking if I was okay or begging for gossip. Instead of feeling ashamed, I mostly felt clarity. My parents cared more about controlling the story than facing the truth. Across town, Isla read the article too and called me. He just made this a matter of public record, she said. That means discovery. And discovery goes both ways. Her voice held the same satisfaction I felt when someone pushed a system so hard it finally tripped every alarm they had ignored for years. For once, the spotlight my mom craved was pointed at paperwork she could not edit with a phone call. The first crack in Sydney's loyalty came from a landline number I did not recognize, a rehab facility outside Fort Lauderdale that specialized in quietly treating people with more credit than judgment. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. Morgan, she said, voice smaller and rougher than I had ever heard it. They have our phones locked up, so I had to use this. She told me she had been there 2 weeks, that counselors kept talking about hitting bottom, and she thought this might qualify. Then the words tumbled out. I'll testify. I'll tell you everything. Dad's been using offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands for years. He moves money from the hospitality trust into fake consulting entities, then into a fund he runs off the books. He tells lenders the Dolores is at 90% occupancy when it's barely at 70. He said it was just how business works. But they're telling me it's fraud. Real fraud. I don't want to be him. Hearing her say that about the man she had worshipped for decades hit me harder than any headline. I leaned against my living room window, looking out at the high rises around me and pressing the phone tighter to my ear to keep my voice level. Why now? I asked. Because your credit dried up? She let out a broken laugh. Partly, she admitted, but also because he had me log in and sign things. Just quick approvals. They say my name is on some of this paperwork. I don't want to go down for stuff I didn't understand. You stopped it. I can see that now. You didn't wreck the family. You stopped us from wrecking ourselves. She took a shaky breath. Just don't let him throw me under the bus to save himself. Please. I told her to write down everything she remembered. Account names, bank branches, dates, the phrases he used when he justified it, and send it all to Isla through her counselor. I can't promise to erase your part, I said, but I can promise I won't let him rewrite mine. When I hung up, I realized this was the first time Sydney had ever asked me for help as an equal, not as the invisible tech support she barely noticed. Over the next 2 weeks, Isla turned my data and Sydney's confession into a roadmap. She filed a counter motion that did not just fight the partition suit, it welcomed it, asking for full discovery to properly value the Dolores and attaching years of financial statements, loan agreements, tax returns, and internal emails. She highlighted the clause in my grandmother's will and detailed how demolishing the Skyline Lounge would violate it, not as a sentimental issue, but as a legal one. The same week, Oliver Brooks, the bank manager who handled Pierce accounts, emailed to confirm my co-administrator status and offered written support if anyone questioned my authority. Priya Nair, an IT security consultant I had worked with, messaged to say she would gladly testify that my emergency protocols were textbook best practice and exactly what any responsible administrator should have done. A city inspector, prompted by Isla's letters, visited the Dolores and froze construction until permits and trust issues were resolved, slapping a bright notice on the door that ended up in a few tourist photos. Vendors who once extended credit started demanding payment up front. The forensic accountant's preliminary report was blunt, between offshore transfers, inflated occupancy reports, and mischaracterized consulting fees. My dad had built a house of cards sturdy enough for parties and fragile enough to collapse the moment anyone breathed near the files. The moment Trevor realized how far his client had overreached came in a phone call Isla took on speaker in my apartment, while my neighbor and podcast co-host Sadie sat at my counter eating takeout. His voice, smooth in earlier messages, had lost its easy confidence. "We all know drawn-out litigation isn't ideal," he began. "My client is open to discussing a resolution that avoids unnecessary discovery." Isla met my eyes and raised one eyebrow. "We're always open to reasonable settlement discussions," she said, "but we're not afraid of discovery. My client has nothing to hide." After a long pause, he asked hypothetically whether I would consider restoring access if my dad bought out my interest in the Dolores for a fair sum. Sadie mouthed, "He's panicking around a forkful of noodles." After Isla hung up, Sadie called from the kitchen translation. He saw the spreadsheets and wants the genie back in the bottle. Isla laughed once. Too late. "The bottle shattered when they filed," she said, and scheduled a settlement conference, telling me to bring every ounce of calm I had ever learned in boardrooms and therapy, because we were about to lay out the receipts in a way even my dad could not ignore. 6 weeks after that rooftop dinner, I walked into Isla's conference room on a humid Monday morning and sat on our side of a long table facing my dad, Trevor, and a junior associate who kept glancing at the door as if he might escape through it. A giant screen at the end of the room displayed a title slide, "Pierce Hospitality Trust Selected Findings." My dad looked older, gray, streaking his temples, anger sitting just under his skin like a storm over the ocean. Trevor opened with a speech about family harmony and slid over a folder offering $500,000 to compensate me for my interest in the Dolores mutual releases and my agreement to reinstate access and stop disparaging the family. Isla did not touch the paper. Instead, she tapped her laptop and filled the screen with a bar chart of transfers from the Hospitality Reserve to Sunrise Casino logos under each bar. The next slides showed my emails flagging problems, my dad's signed responses, wire confirmations to Cayman accounts that never showed up on tax returns, and finally the Skyline Lounge demolition plans side by side with my grandmother's will. By the time she finished, Trevor's voice had lost its edge. The junior associate looked slightly green, and my dad would not meet my eyes. The negotiation was quiet. No table pounding, just whispered conferences and long silences broken only by the faint sound of traffic far below. When it ended, the agreement said my dad would wire $3 million to buy out my interest in the Dolores. We would release civil claims. Nothing in the deal would block regulators from doing their jobs, and I would never again serve as the family's tech safety net in any capacity. There was a mutual non-disparagement clause limited to future public statements, but nothing in it could erase court filings or evidence already shared. 2 days later, the wire hit my account, and my mom left a voicemail accusing me of trading them for a pile of cash and some dusty records. I saved it for my lawyer, blocked their numbers, set filters to route their emails to a folder I would never open, and stepped away. Over the next months, cousins mentioned lenders tightening terms, vendors filing suits, and the Dolores sitting half-renovated a monument to their decisions, and to the moment they underestimated the quiet daughter who built their system. I did not gloat. I just noted the cause and effect the way you do when a model behaves exactly as predicted. 6 months later, I was in a condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows, my grandmother's records along one wall, and a dining table filled with friends and mentees who respected my boundaries. Isla sat at one end telling a story about a judge's cutting one-liner. Oliver and his husband talked about moving to a quieter neighborhood and finally getting a dog. Priya laughed about a client who kept his passwords on sticky notes, then turned serious and asked Kyla, my mentee, how her first solo project was going. Kyla poked at her salad and admitted her mom kept sending her mortgage documents to look over quickly. The table went quiet. "Ask her if she'd send those to a stranger and expect them to do it for free," I said. "If the answer is no, charge her or say no. Your skills are not a family favor." Sadie raised her glass. To Morgan, who turned pity into a firewall, she joked, and everyone laughed, but there was a layer of truth in it I felt down to my bones. Later, alone on my balcony with my journal, I wrote, "They said pity is why they included me." They were right that pity was involved. It just took me 32 years to realize it was mine. When people hear parts of this story, some of them say I could never cut off my family like that. They talk about obligations, about respect, about how blood is thicker than water, as if cliches can patch over decades of being used and dismissed. What they do not see is the years of small cuts that came before the big one, the way my parents treated my time and expertise as an endless free resource while mocking the very thing that made that expertise possible. They do not see my dad's signature on documents he did not bother reading, trusting that I would clean up any mess, or my mom's eagerness to use my grandmother's lounge as a design playground while calling my attachment to it childish. For years, I heard their lines and bent myself into shapes that would make their version of love less painful. The night she weaponized the word pity in front of a room full of strangers, I finally heard what she had actually been saying all along. They did not see me as a daughter. They saw me as a convenient tool. Tools can be put down. Tools can be locked away. Tools do not owe their users anything, and neither do I. If you are listening to this and thinking about your own family, about the favors that are not really favors, the jokes that cut too deep, the way you are only loved when you are useful, I want you to hear me clearly. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to lock doors, change passwords, and say no even if the people on the other side share your last name. I will never forgive my parents for what they did, and I will never go back. That is not cruelty. It is self-preservation, and it is the only reason I am not still sitting at their table swallowing insults between bites. The biggest lesson I learned is that loyalty without respect is just a trap, and I refuse to live in one ever again. Thank you for listening to my story. Tell me in the comments what you would do in my place and where you are listening from, because somewhere out there is someone who needs to hear that it is okay to choose yourself.